So with the upcoming release of Spider-Man the PS4 game and all the rumours surrounding Spider-Man Far From Home, I thought it was a really good time to talk about the previous 6 Spider-Man films we as an audience have gotten and rank them from best to worst. Everyone loves a little best to worst film and hearing people's opinions on which they think is the worst and best films in a series, so I thought why not? Spider-Man is such a iconic character, he's probably the most famous superhero. I know people might disagree, might say Superman, Batman are more iconic than Spider-Man. But if you actually look at merchandise sales, Spider-Man ranks the highest. So Spider-Man truly is the most iconic superhero around. So I think it's really interesting to look at the 6 films that have come out as they truly vary in quality, which is very evident with a lot of superhero films. And Spider-Man films did inspire a lot of superhero films we get today, but they've also shown how bad they can be. So let's just jump into what I think is the worst Spider-Man film. So the worst Spider-Man film to be released is, you know it, you love it, well, you hate it, Amazing Spider-Man 2. So Amazing Spider-Man 2, it's not a terrible film, it's bad, but it's not terrible. The problem with Amazing Spider-Man 2 is it does what studios do nowadays, and it shoehorns in far too much to get a cinematic universe going. We have 3 villains, which didn't work in a previous Spider-Man film, and more subplots than anyone can keep track of. The film is very claustrophobic, very muddled, there isn't a clear story. It is backed with very good performances by Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone, but the film doesn't follow a very good plot line. It jumps about too much and people can't settle into the film and understand what's going on because they're too busy trying to say, look what's about to come. Look what's about to come here with villains and other different plot lines. What studios miss is that you need to make a good film to launch a cinematic universe, and this film sadly falls into the trap of trying to shoehorn in too much to try and further the films that you make. So for that reason, Amazing Spider-Man 2 comes bottom on my list of Spider-Man films. Next on my list is Spider-Man 3. So Spider-Man 3 came at the end of a very good series in Spider-Man 1 and 2, the original Spider-Man series, all the Spider-Man films that kind of been building up to this film, and it was a huge letdown. I mean, it was very similar to how X-Men 1 and 2 built up to the third X-Men, and that again was a letdown. But this film really shows what can happen when a studio interferes far too much with a director's vision. Sam Raimi had been doing a very good job with the first 2 Spider-Man films, and they become profitable and critically very well received, and the audience received them exceptionally well. Now Sony was paying attention to what was being made with Spider-Man, and they were pushing for Venom to be in the film, which Sam Raimi did not want. I think he wanted him in Spider-Man 4, and the problem is this film falls into exactly the same trap as Amazing Spider-Man 2. There's far too much going on. There are 3 villains in this film yet again. There's a lot of subplots in this film. I think at one point we don't see the Sandman for about 30 to 40 minutes, which is ridiculous. He's supposed to be the villain of the film, but once again the film is backed up with good performances. I think Tobey Maguire gets a very harsh time now as Spider-Man, but the films are very of his time and he is a good Spider-Man. But the film falls in the same problems as Main Spider-Man 2, far too much going on, too many villains, and the story is not focused. So next up at number 4 is Amazing Spider-Man. Now Amazing Spider-Man is not a bad film, but it's not a good film. It sits right in the middle. So this film was made to reboot the whole series after Sam Raimi left after Spider-Man 3, and there was going to be no Spider-Man 4. It's very odd because Amazing Spider-Man was made 5 years after the previous Spider-Man film, so we got a reboot within 5 years, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. But Amazing Spider-Man really does nothing new with the character. It's pretty much a complete rehash telling, shot for shot, of the first Spider-Man films. There's so many shots in this that are just straight from the original Spider-Man, which is really odd. Andrew Garfield exceeds as Spider-Man. He is a very good Spider-Man, and Emma Stone is very good as Gwen Stacy. These two share amazing chemistry, far better what Kirsten Dunst and Tobey Maguire shared in the original Spider-Man films. But nothing new is happening with the character, but they are setting up the character very well, and after seeing Amazing Spider-Man, I thought, yeah, the film is fine. It hasn't done anything new with the character, but I think it is a good stepping stone for this new series. And I was excited for Amazing Spider-Man 2. I thought they had a good cast, they had a fairly good director behind this, and I thought they could really make something great. They made a safe film, which was probably the best idea at the time, but sadly we know how that all ended. But overall, Amazing Spider-Man, it's a fine film. I think if you watch this first before you watch the original Spider-Man, you will enjoy this film a lot more. But that's just my opinion. opinion. Next up has to be the original Spider-Man film. Now, the original Spider-Man film was fantastic when it was released. It was very revolutionary in the superhero story. It has fantastic performance by William Dafoe. The CGI is not amazing, but it's okay for the time. It was very similar in X-Men and showed that these films can be successful. These superhero films can be very successful when made correctly and when they're good. And I think thanks to X-Men and Spider-Man, we are getting fantastic superhero films today, and they are very much at the forefront of inspiring that. Rewatching Spider-Man, it is very of its time. It's very cheesy. I forgot how cheesy the film actually is. It does have its good parts, especially with, as mentioned before, William Dafoe and even J.K. Simmons' portrayals of their characters, but like I say, it is a little bit corny and cheesy, but it's still a fun film, and it was of its time, so it hasn't aged fantastically well, but I still like it. Next up on this list is Spider-Man 2. Now, Spider-Man 2 is deemed, even today, as one of the best superhero films ever made. And I tend to agree. It deals with issues that haven't been explored in superhero films before, dealing with Peter Parker actually wanting to be Spider-Man and what it means to be Spider-Man. They also have a very complex villain in Dr. Octopus, and we see he's fall from grace from being a man with high aspirations to, once he loses the things he loves, what will that do to a person? And obviously he becomes evil. And the film is just incredibly engaging. It's Tobey Maguire's best performance as Spider-Man. Kristen Dunst she is Kristen Dunst, like, she's not great, but she does well in this film. And this film truly looks into what makes Peter Parker, that selflessness, that wanting to do good, and what makes him who he is. So it is a fantastic film. I definitely recommend go and watch it if you've never seen it before, because it might be one of the best superhero films ever made. So lastly, completely contradicting what I just said there, the best Spider-Man film to be made is Spider-Man Homecoming. Now, Spider-Man Homecoming was a complete surprise. I didn't think this would actually be any good, even if Marvel have a fantastic track record, but it was still being made by Sony in a sense, so I was still a bit worried about this, but it is a fantastic film. Tom Holland is hands down the best Spider-Man we've had. He is definitely better than Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, and I love how the film tells the story of Peter Parker. We are actually seeing a 15-year-old dealing with these powers. The other films never really dealt much into Spider-Man as a high schooler. They always quickly got him out of that, but this one, yeah, it deals with how would a 15-year-old react to having these powers, and the scene where Tom Holland is under all that rubble and he can't lift it, that was really powerful, because if I was 15, 16 in that situation, I would break down crying. I would be scared, and that is what we should deal with Peter Parker. We should see him on this journey, learning about his powers and what are his weaknesses. So especially in the Washington scene where there are no buildings for him to swing on, we see, yeah, Spider-Man actually does have a lot of weaknesses, and if the environment is not correct for Spider-Man, he is very vulnerable. So I think it was a fantastic film. We have a great villain in Michael Keaton as the Vulture, and I just enjoyed it from start to finish, and I think for me it is the best Spider-Man film. I think as well, a lot of the Spider-Man films before this one have not aged very well, so maybe in 10 years I might think Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man 2 are more on the same level, but I just think the original Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2, they are quite corny and they haven't aged for today's films compared to some other superhero films. But that's my list from the worst to best. Do any of you agree with me? Do you think I'm a complete idiot for what I've just said? I'm sure a lot of you will think that. Please leave a like, please comment, what do you think? And as always, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.